If we did implement Lummis's plan, that would involve the US buying 5% of the Bitcoin supply. That could spark a global war for Bitcoin, and we could easily see Bitcoin hit 500K under that scenario.
We all want to believe in something. In Chinese, belief also means trust. We want to trust our systems and each other so we can build a future beyond what we know. Join us at Consensus Hong Kong, where belief becomes real.
Hello and welcome to Markets Daily, hosted by me, Jen Sanasi. On this show, we navigate the currents shaping the crypto markets, providing insights against the broader financial landscape. So, whether you're actively investing or simply fascinated by the volatility that is the crypto markets, this show is your compass to understanding what's happened, where we are, and where we're going. On today's show, we have GSR Investments Head of Research, Brian Rudick, joining us. Brian, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Of course. Thanks for being here. We got to just start off. Markets are not really doing much this morning. We heard from the AI and crypto czar in the first press conference he's done yesterday. A lot of people were thinking that markets would react positively to that, but they kind of just remained flat after that speech. Talk to me about what you're watching.
Yeah, it's been a bit of an odd 24 hours. So in my mind, we've got several actually fairly large positives, but also several fairly large negatives as well. So on the positive side, you have Trump delaying tariffs on Mexico and Canada yesterday. You also have the fact that Trump signed an executive order to create a sovereign wealth fund. I think some are hopeful that it could include digital assets. And then you also, as you mentioned, US crypto czar David Sachs held this press conference to outline US crypto strategy. He did announce a congressional working group that will push on legislation. This is super important. So those are the positives, but there are also negatives. So China announced retaliatory tariffs on certain US imports. Sachs's press conference could have disappointed on the strategic reserve front. The details there were not plentiful. And he did mention that it was, quote unquote, in the very early stages, which I think is disappointing some. And then lastly, equities and tech stocks are getting hit. It was off of poor earnings by Google and AMD, but that is probably weighing some too. So in my mind, all these things are washing out, and that's why the total crypto market cap is fairly flat this morning.
Well, let's talk about some of the things you mentioned there. Let's start with the strategic reserve. The crypto community was really bullish on the strategic reserve, looking at how the administration is moving. I think a lot of folks were thinking that this is something that could move quickly. Sachs's remarks yesterday said, they're evaluating the feasibility. The committee hasn't even been fully formed yet. Talk to me about what your thoughts are on the strategic reserve. Could we have a strategic reserve in 2025? And what would that mean for crypto markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is one of the two key areas to be watching. To me, I was always at very low odds of this actually occurring. One, because it likely requires an act of Congress, which is not a given. And then number two, there's actually a decent amount of pushback by like ex-Treasury and Fed officials. And a lot of folks just don't think it is like this great idea. But what I'd say is Trump likes the idea. Obviously, like a lot of folks that he's put in key positions are also very pro crypto. Senator Lummis is pushing really hard on it, trying to be very forward thinking. So I do think it has a chance. I guess two other notes. One is I actually think it depends on how it's implemented in terms of like its market impact. If we simply just hold on to the 20 billion of confiscated BTC, it does lend credence to Bitcoin as a reserve asset. It could encourage other nations to buy, but it doesn't really result in net US buying from here. But if we did implement Lummis's plan, that would involve the US buying 5% of the Bitcoin supply. That could spark a global war for Bitcoin, and we could easily see Bitcoin hit 500K under that scenario. Last thing that I would mention is that I guess since Trump was inaugurated, like the odds of a strategic reserve has gone down a bit, at least relative to what folks were hoping for. His executive order only ordered the government to actually study it rather than implement one. And then he also referred to it as a national digital asset stockpile. I think that terminology was confusing folks. Digital assets could imply it will hold more than BTC. If so, probably harder to actually implement. And then number two, the term stockpile, maybe that means just holding on to what you already have rather than buying more, I think was a bit disappointing as well. So odds are probably a bit lower versus like November, like right after he was elected. But I still think it is a possibility.
You said something that we have to dig a little bit deeper on there. You said if Lummis's plan did go into effect, we could see 500K Bitcoin. I think anyone listening, their ears probably perked up right there. Um, it sounds like what you're saying, though, is that Lummis's plan, as she presented it last year at the Bitcoin conference, may not be rolled out in that exact way. And so, where do you see the price of Bitcoin going in the short term? And then I ask you the same question by the end of the year.
Yeah, that is a great question. It's really hard to handicap whether or not Lummis's plan will actually get accepted. I think we have a much more open Congress towards digital assets than before. I mean, that is just a fact. Industry's done a great job getting a lot of folks that are at least open to crypto elected. But yeah, as far as like near term, I'm actually fairly mixed. The market actually feels a bit more risky to me in terms of the backdrop after some of the risk events that we've had, like DeepSeek, like the announcement of tariffs. But we're also lower here and off the highs. So in my mind, we're probably range bound between low 90s and 106 to 108K until something breaks us out. There's kind of a decent amount of negatives and positives here that in my mind offset. So on the negative side, hard to know what positive catalyst over the next few weeks will bring us much higher. Macro doesn't seem to be cooperating, especially with the Fed's easing cycle now in question. Hard to know what will incite more retail mania than like what the Trump meme coin did. Hearing some folks point to that as the ultimate top signal. MicroStrategy buying will probably slow just for the simple fact that they bought 22 billion last year, and it's really hard to keep up that pace. But we do have some positives. So Trump's over-delivered on crypto. No reason to think that that will stop. Hard to really know what he'll do. So like mentioned, the sovereign wealth fund could actually add crypto to that. Agencies are in process of clarifying rules. So the SEC has established a crypto task force. Could see resolution on outstanding SEC actions. You could see the SEC approve spot digital asset ETFs. We could see them establish a safe harbor rule, which would enable issuers to launch tokens and know they won't get sued. And then the last thing is more corporates are buying BTC. It seems like every day there's a new announcement, and states are doing it too. So 15 states right now actually have legislation to establish a state level Bitcoin reserve. I'm hearing that some of these are a lock to actually occur. And so I think like there are a fair amount of positive catalysts as well. So when I think about at least the next several weeks, in my mind, we're probably range bound, and those positives and negatives kind of offset each other.
Where do you think we end the year?
I think much higher. I think we've got two big swings at bat. One is to establish comprehensive digital asset legislation in the US. I really think that the importance of this cannot be underestimated. I think in terms of traditional companies, they've got these great, I guess, real world businesses that likely need for the rules to be codified before they jump in a big way. And I really think that once we do have comprehensive digital asset legislation in the US, you're going to see all these incumbent players jump in, and it's going to lead to this step change function in activity, in participation, in development. And they have such vast distribution, capital, talent, built-in trust, all these things. I really think that that will take the industry and prices much, much higher. When we do get that, could be a 2026 event because rulemaking is easy, legislation is harder, but I do think we will get that eventually. And then the other thing, as we've mentioned, is just the strategic Bitcoin reserve. My mind's still low odds, but it's worth so much in terms of prices. If it does happen, that in some sort of expected value framework, it still is worth something to prices. So yeah, hard to put a number on it.
I was going to ask you, I was going to say the people want a number, Brian.
Yeah, my best guess is 150 to 175. I think like the underlying trickle in of like more people accepting and using Bitcoin, the ETF still doing well, it'll just put this gradual upward pressure on it. And then we have these two big events that, if they happen, and I actually do think like we will get comprehensive digital asset legislation in the US at least by end of next year, will take us much, much higher than even that.
Okay, thank you for giving me a number. People don't always do that, so I appreciate you. I want to talk about the Fed and some of those risk events that you previously mentioned that are still prevalent. So we have Canada and Mexico tariffs on pause right now, China retaliating on tariffs. Um, Over the weekend, we saw crypto markets reacting to what was going on in this tariff war. Uh, Traditional markets were closed, so I think that was expected, that crypto markets would be where people went to react. How do you expect the markets to react to this ongoing back and forth? What do you think is going to happen in the next 30 days when it comes to these trade wars?
Yeah, I think that markets hate uncertainty. So obviously this induces uncertainty. So that's a negative. Number two, like there is a positive correlation between crypto and traditional markets. So as negative events related to like the tariffs come out, traditional markets move lower, crypto will too. And so I think like these things will cause heightened volatility. In my mind, I actually think like it could be a good buying opportunity. So I think that Trump is unlikely to fully follow through on these tariffs for a number of reasons. So first, he seems to be using them mostly for negotiating purposes. Number two, most people actually think the tariffs are a horrible idea. And so like obviously like maybe he doesn't fully follow through with them. And then third, he actually cares deeply about market performance for both like equity markets and digital assets. I mean, he has his own meme coin, which is like a significant portion of his net worth, maybe not all liquid, but he now has this vested interest in keeping like digital asset markets at least like stable and supporting them as much as he can. So I think for all those reasons, it's unlikely that we start this trade war with the whole world. And I actually expect some of these things to come off at least somewhat. So I think like there'll be more volatility. And anytime like BTC gets into the low 90s, I actually think could be like a good entry point for someone looking to trade that fall.
You just mentioned that crypto markets are kind of in lockstep with traditional markets right now. Do you see a divergence there? And what would cause that? Because Bitcoin traditionally was the opposite of traditional markets. Now it's not anymore, as we have Bitcoin ETFs and Bitcoin becomes more mainstream. Is there any event that you could see that maybe Bitcoin trades in lockstep with traditional markets and maybe alts diverge the other way?
Yeah, having a hard time coming up with a situation that would answer that last question.
Hmm.
Candidly, I've always been a bit perplexed when people look at Bitcoin as like this risk off asset. I've been in crypto full time for 4 years. Before that, I spent a decade mostly at hedge funds, like watching the market super closely. And I guess with the caveat that I actually haven't like studied this empirically, crypto in my book is like squarely a risky risk asset. So anytime you see like risk assets move down in price, crypto tends to move down even more. And it's really hard for me to come up with examples, especially over the last few years, that kind of counteract that. Maybe the US banking crisis a little bit, but not really. And so, it always kind of perplexes me when folks say, like, oh, everyone's going to move to Bitcoin as a safe haven. I don't think that's how the markets are treating it. Certainly, as the markets get more institutionalized, as you mentioned, and more institutional investors are actually playing in the crypto markets, I only think that this will further that notion of like Bitcoin and crypto as a risk asset. So, yes, I would not actually expect it to act the opposite way.
All right. And before we wrap up here, let's talk about the Fed expecting 2 rate cuts in 2025. Talk to me about how you expect the Fed to move throughout the year and what you expect the markets to do.
Yeah. Well, they've said they're going to be data dependent. I expect that's what they will do. You've had like Fed officials come out and argue both sides of things. I do think that if inflation moves down as they expect, the latest summary of economic projections has them cutting 50 bips this year. That was down from the prior SEP. So I do think like market expectations for Fed cuts have come off. I haven't looked at Fed fund futures recently, but last time I did was like 2 weeks ago, and markets were fully aligned with what the Fed had released, expecting on average 2 cuts essentially. So I suspect they'll be data dependent. Obviously, like payrolls on Friday is really important to watch, but I think inflation is the more key variable. I think if inflation cooperates and continues to move more towards its 2% target, especially like PCE, which is their preferred inflation gauge, then I do think like that will give them more room to cut. But if like inflation does prove to be sticky, then they might not cut at all. So I think it's really hard to know. If I did know, I'd probably be a macro trader, but I think it'll mostly depend on the incoming data.
Brian, thanks so much for joining Markets Daily today.
Thank you. Really appreciate you having me.
Of course, thanks for coming on. And for our audience, if you enjoyed this conversation, Brian's colleagues from GSR Investments are going to be joining us in Hong Kong for Consensus on February 18th, 19th, and 20th. So if you don't already have your tickets, come on down to Hong Kong and have a good time with us. We'll be having more in-depth conversations like this about crypto markets and crypto regulation worldwide. Thanks so much for listening to Markets Daily today. If you enjoy this podcast, subscribe to the CoinDesk Podcast Network that is available on all podcast platforms. If you prefer watching us, we are on YouTube. Subscribe to us, give us a thumbs up, and we will see you tomorrow.